Every player has run into this universal problem at least once during character creation. I would love to play a character like that one guy from insert X anime, TV show, movie, comic. I could keep naming more. But that character doesn't fit cleanly within any of the base classes. So how can you make it work? Well, you can search online for something that might fit, but it is always a gamble taking something online and hoping that it is remotely balanced. You shouldn't trust everything you see on the internet. Except for me. Don't click off. And what better way to ensure that your homebrew class is balanced and tailored to your needs than to make it yourself? And that is where I come in. In this video, we are going to be creating a template based on data that we're going to calculate from the pre-existing D&D 5e classes. Well, let's get into it. We are going to start from absolute zero because that is where all homebrew starts. But before we can even write anything down or do any calculations, we are going to have to make a couple assumptions about the type of class we are making. In this video, we are going to be focused on how to create a martial class. I believe that the martial classes and the spellcasting classes are just too different from one another, and that it'd be better if they had both their own videos. I'm also only going to be looking at the first 11 levels because 1, most campaigns don't go past level 11, and B, this video was already a whole lot of effort, and I do not want to deal with high-level D&D shenanigans. If you know, you know. I still plan on making those videos in the future, but they are probably going to be based off a lot of the calculations that we're going to do in this video. Okay, we have the type of class we want to make. Now we need to find a way to measure and calculate the balanced version of a martial class. And immediately, we hit our first roadblock when trying to compare the different martial classes. You see, when trying to compare two separate things, you need to control as many variables as possible to ensure that the comparison is the most accurate it can be. I'll give an example. Let's say we have two people really into weightlifting and they want to figure out who's stronger between the two of them. To definitively say that one person is stronger than the other, they both need to be lifting the same weights and doing the same exercise. Saying that one person is stronger because they can squat 300 pounds, which is more than the second person can bench, is just not a fair comparison. So how does this relate back to our problem? Well, D&D has a whole lot of variables within character creation and even within how we're measuring damage. So I'm going to try my best to run through all these variables and how we're going to control them as quickly as possible. In character creation, you can have different species, ability scores, equipment, and several other small things that you can choose. This can cause a large variety in damage, even with two characters that are the same class. So how are we going to solve those problems? For species, we're going to assume that every class is a human. For ability scores, we're going to just use standard array. For equipment, we are also going to assume that each class is choosing the weapon they can deal the most damage with. I also just want to mention that in this video, I'm using the 2014 rules and not the updated rule set. So now that we got those out the way, how are we going to measure strength? To ensure that our parameters are fair, I'm going to assume that per each long rest, there are 6 combats lasting 4 rounds each and 2 long rests. This will help us measure how frequently a feature can be used per combat and per long rest. I took the 6 combats and the 2 short rests from the DMG, and the 4 rounds per combat I kind of just assumed. I know it's not the most scientific way to determine the number, but you know, we work with what we're given. I am also assuming that per each round of combat, the character will end up choosing their most damaging option if available. I will also be giving these characters +1, +2, +3 weapons and armors as advised by the DMG. Finally, all attacks and damage calculations will be against an AC of 15. The specific AC doesn't necessarily matter. I just chose 15 because I think the number looked nice. We've controlled all of the variables we can. Now, let's get into the actual damage calculations. The main numbers that I want to look for is the average damage per round and the max damage per round. I've already come up with a formula to do those, and I'm going to show them on screen now. Explaining what these formulas mean real quickly, H will be our chance to hit. To find that, you just take the number of outcomes that are a successful hit and divide that by the total number of outcomes, i.e. 20 for a 20-sided dice. An example of this is if a character has a +5 to hit against an AC of 15, rolls 1 through 9 would be a miss, and rolls 10 through 20 would be a hit. Thus, you will have 11 successful outcomes. 11 over 20 is 0.55. DA would be the average of your weapon's dice result. To calculate this, you take the sum of all the outcomes divided by the total number of outcomes. For instance, a D4, the number of outcomes is 4 because it's a 4-sided dice, and the outcomes are 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 is 10. 10 divided by 4 gives you a DA of 2.5. M will be our damage modifier. It's just the corresponding strength or dexterity modifier for the weapon you're using. W will be our weapon bonus if you have a +1, +2, or +3 weapon. And then F will be our feature bonus. This will come from the class features later on that give additional damage for attacks. And they're all going to be calculated a bit differently, so we're just going to set that aside for now. Max damage per round we're going to calculate a bit differently, but it's going to use a lot of the same variables. The only one that's going to be different will be DM, and that's just going to be the max result that you can get on a dice. So for a D4, the max result you can get is a 4. So what I did next was I took both of these formulas and calculated the average damage per round and the max damage per round for all of the martial classes, for each level of them as well. Now, I could go into depth on how I did all these calculations for each level, but I think that would make this video more boring than a video on math and Dungeons and Dragons already is. Instead, I'm just going to pick a few class features that stood out and how I calculated them. First, we have the fighter's action surge. For that, I assumed that the fighter would always take the attack action to maximize their damage output. To calculate the additional damage that action surge provides per round, I took the number of rounds that you could use action surge per long rest and divided it by the total amount of rounds per long rest, or 24. I then multiplied that result by the average damage you would do without the 2-hit chance. The rogue sneak attack was a little bit interesting because it is a conditional feature, but an unlimited one. Sneak attack isn't very hard to pull off, so I assumed that any given attack would have a 75% chance of having the sneak attack damage on top of it. And for the monk's unarmed strike, I had to separate it out from the initial weapon attack that the monk gets. Without further ado, here are the results I got from calculating and comparing these different martial classes to one another. Now, I can let you stare at these graphs and let you figure out what it all means, but I think it's going to be better for the both of us if I just explain what's significant about all of this and how this relates back to creating Homebrew. So the first thing I noticed immediately when looking at this data is that the rogue is a big outlier in terms of damage. Despite seeming like a big damage dealer, the rogue has significantly less damage on average than the rest of the classes. My best guess is the fact that the rogue doesn't get any extra attacks really holds back their damage potential. You will also notice that most of the classes have a large jump in their power at level 5. I'm also theorizing that the rogue was held back in terms of damage because they were giving a lot of great class features that don't necessarily help them out in terms of damage, such as like expertise or cunning action or evasion. So from this data, we can actually extract out the averages and the range of damage that you want your class to be in per level. So when trying to figure out the different class features and equipment that you're going to give your homebrew class, you can always back calculate the correct amount of damage that you need to make sure that your class is balanced. And of course, you're going to be calculating that with the formulas and parameters shown in the previous parts of this video. But let's put a pause on that for now and talk about the defensive capabilities of our theoretical balanced homebrew class. For our defensive features, we only really need to consider AC and health for right now. These are pretty self-explanatory. I won't dive in too deep, but I'll still talk about them a little bit. For health, as a martial class, we only have 3 options: a D8, a D10, or a D12. When considering what hit dice to choose, I would think about what type of role you want your class to take on. A D12 if you want a tanky build, a D10 if you want a frontliner, and a D8 if you're looking for a more damage dealing type of class. AC is going to be a bit harder for us to pin down because it relies on the type of armor and the dexterity score that your character has. But something to keep in mind when you're making your class is if you are making a class that relies heavily on a dex score, you will most likely be giving your character a good AC. And while we are discussing defensive capabilities, you also want to keep in mind class abilities such as reckless attack from the barbarian or cunning action like the rogue has that can increase or decrease the amount of incoming damage that your character might take. You are looking for a bit of a push and pull between your class's offensive and defensive capabilities. It may go without being said, but I'll say it anyways. If your class is good at everything, it is probably not balanced. So if you have a class primarily focused on dealing a lot of damage, it is better to decrease the amount of defense that class has and vice versa. Okay, now the part I've kind of been dreading a little bit. Class features. No matter how hard I try, class features can't necessarily be measured and compared to one another. So I believe that it is better to provide a list of class feature types and the ranges of each of these types that you want to have for your homebrew class. These class features are an additional way to help balance your class. If you're wanting to have a lot of features and a lot of strong features as well, I would go back to trying to lower your offensive and defensive capabilities. That being said, I created some categories to fit all of the class abilities from the martial classes. And while I'm listing them out, I'm also going to provide the range for each category type that you want to include for your homebrew class. Starting with 2 to 3 subclass features, 0 to 3 non-combat features, 2 to 8 non-damaging combat features, 2 to 4 ability score improvements, and 2 to 5 damaging combat features. And damaging features weren't just features that dealt straight damage, but I also included features that raised your average damage per round. This could be stuff like action surge or reckless attack that make it more likely for you to deal damage. The total amount of class features that you should include should range between 12 and 18. We got the total number of features as well as the different feature types. Now we just need to figure out how to space them so that our average damage per round, our max damage per round, and our defensive capabilities line up to how we defined them before. Some of the placements of these features are pretty easy, such as the subclass features. You almost always get your first one at level 3 and then get your additional ones every 3 or 4 levels. Ability score improvements are also almost always on even levels, such as 6, 8, 10, etc. Also, almost every class starts with some class feature that enhances their damage output in some way, shape, or form very early on, like levels 1 or 2. Other than that, there's nothing strict that you necessarily have to follow when assigning your class features. Something I also noticed when examining these 4 classes is that they typically have 1, maybe 2 features that tended to evolve as they leveled up, such as sneak attack damage or rage damage and uses or key points, stuff like that. It would be a good idea to think of something similar for your class, but it isn't necessary if you don't want it. Here is an example list of features per level that I came up with using the parameters I defined before. Again, this is not the only layout you can use. There are so many different possible combinations, but if you are lazy and don't want to come up with one, just use this template. We've gotten most of the hard stuff out of the way for our template. There's just a few more things to consider if we want to ensure that we have a full-fledged class. This includes stuff like proficiencies, equipment, and maybe even a flavor description of your class as well. Proficiencies include stuff like armor, weapons, tools, saving throws, and skills. A few things to note there is that saving throw proficiencies always come in pairs, so I would choose the primary ability score and the secondary ability score that is associated with the class you're making. Skill proficiencies also tend to come in pairs, but they can have more. For instance, the rogue has 4. I would reserve doing this if you're making a less combat-centric class. When deciding what starting equipment to give your class, think back to how it's going to affect your average damage or your defensive capabilities. The core of our theoretical homebrew class is now complete. I could stop here, but I would be leaving a very important chunk of our class unfinished, and that is subclasses. If you are just making this class for yourself or for one of your players, you don't really have to be concerned with making more than one subclass. But if you are planning for multiple people to use this class, or you just want a finished class, you'll need to come up with multiple subclasses. And subclass features, like the many other class features, are where you can let your creativity shine. The main difference between your subclass features and your other class features is that you're aiming for a thematic grouping between your various subclass features. Each subclass should change the direction that your class is going in, and maybe even completely changing the playstyle of your class. And while I can't necessarily give you an empirical right way to build a subclass, I can give a few examples and advice on how I would build one. Most damaging features come from the base class itself. There's not many subclasses that offer a whole lot of additional damage. While I don't necessarily see any problems giving damaging features within your subclass, if you've already reached your desired average damage, it's wise not to give any more damage within your subclass. Your subclass should also not only serve a thematic purpose, but also a gameplay purpose as well. It is all well and good if you have 2 subclasses that are very thematically different, but if they end up playing similarly and have very similar mechanics, they aren't going to end up feeling any different. You want the choice of the subclass to not only seem or appear meaningful, but also be mechanically meaningful. Also, just general advice, you typically want your subclasses to reflect the original base class. If you end up making a subclass that has nothing to do with the original base class, it could end up feeling clunky either mechanically or thematically. And if you are struggling coming up with subclass ideas, here are a few archetypes that I came up with that you can use. First is the base class but more. This subclass is just going to be focusing on enhancing a lot of the existing features within the base class. Next, we're going to have our dip into the another archetype. If your base class is primarily a damage dealing type of class, it may be cool to have a subclass that gives support or defensive options. Next, we've got the I've Got Magic subclass. Like it says on the tin, give your class spellcasting. Next up, we got the Pacifist, a subclass that primarily gives features that are meant to be used outside of combat. You could also make a subclass that relies on a different ability score than your primary one. Say for instance you have a class that mainly relies on your strength ability score. Maybe you make a subclass that has features that use the intelligence ability score. And last but not least, of course, we have the experimental subclass. This is where you implement some weird ideas that use mechanics rarely seen or not seen at all in D&D. I would be cautious with this one though. At this point in the video, we've talked about every aspect of creating a homebrew class. But that is not good enough for me. If you've made it to this point in the video, I want to reward you by giving my homebrew class template. It's a PDF that I've put in the description of this video that not only goes a little bit more in depth, but provides a step-by-step process for you to use to create your own homebrew class. If you would like for me to do this for the remaining 9 levels, or to make a video on how to create a spellcaster class, let me know down in the comments. I would also be more than happy to answer any questions you have about the template or anything I talked about in this video. You can also let me know if you think I messed up somewhere or you would like to see something included that I may have missed. Of course, if you found this video at all helpful or interesting, I would really appreciate if you liked and subscribed. I am also in the process of making a web series on how to create a D&D campaign and world from scratch. In this web series, I build an example world and campaign and give advice on how to do each of those steps yourself. I also have tutorials on how to craft beginner and magnetic terrain if you would like physical terrain for your D&D table. With all of that being said, bye for now.